Welcome to Lecture 3 of Startup Engineering. I'm your instructor, Balaji Srinivasan. Today we're going to talk about Linux and file system basics and kind of getting your way around the Linux operating system. And we're also going to introduce server-side JavaScript and show how to edit and run a few sample node programs. So let's jump in and talk about the overview with respect to Linux. You're likely a user of the Windows or OS X operating systems, and I won't recapitulate all of this stuff, but basically the idea is that you're used to interacting with a computer through a GUI. We're going to interact for most of this class through the command line interface, and it's worth going over this link over here in particular to understand the distinctions between the various Unix, Linux, BSD, and OS X clones. But the command line interface we're primarily going to use is that associated with the Linux operating system, specifically the distribution called Ubuntu. There are several key features of Linux that are worth keeping in mind. One is that Linux is in general controlled by a command line interface. It doesn't have licensing fees, so you can run many machines. Unlike Windows, you don't need to pay on a per computer basis. Linux is also open source and has a massive base of open source software additions to it, which you can download for free. Most Linux software is geared towards the needs of engineers versus those of, say, end users. So, for example, it's easy to edit movies in Linux, but watching them is a little bit more of a pain. Linux also has something called the server-side loophole. This is a little bit of a complex topic, but it's very important for anybody who's interested in doing anything commercial in the startup space. Essentially, the idea is that if you are running a web application, you can make modifications to GPL license code, including Linux, without distributing said modifications. Unlike, for example, Microsoft, which is actually distributing CDs with shrink-wrapped software. If they made modifications to open source code, including it with their operating system, and then distributed that operating system, they'd have to distribute the source code as well. A web application provider, however, can get away with this because just providing, say, a search box or a social network is not considered to be distributing the software. So this server-side loophole is why internet companies can use a great deal of open source software without necessarily open sourcing their entire code base. Google search code base is not open source. There was a license called the AGPL that was written to close this loophole, and there are major projects like MongoDB that use it. But in general, what's interesting about being an internet startup and using open source is you can sort of eat your cake and have it too. It should be noted that there's other business models, ways to make money with open source. There's the professional open source model pioneered by Red Hat. The problem with this, though, and we'll go into this later in the class, is that a model that's based on consulting is based on a service business versus a product business. And a service business does not scale. You need to add more billable hours by hiring more competent people, and that is just fundamentally a less reproducible process than adding more servers, which you would do in a product business. In terms of how Linux is used in the Valley, in general, it's an OS X client and a Linux server. That is to say, one will run a Windows, or rather a Mac laptop, sometimes a Chromebook, and connect to a development machine that is often a virtual machine, which we'll talk about in a second, running Linux. And this is the standard development environment for most internet startups in the Valley. In terms of distribution, Ubuntu is probably the most overall popular and all-around polished distribution, both for kind of servers and for a so-called desktop environment if you're running Linux on a local machine. It's worth also mentioning Android. It is a Linux-based operating system. One usually doesn't think of it in the same breath as Ubuntu because it is for mobile clients like tablets and smartphones, but it is probably the most popular Linux distribution in the world. Android on Raspberry Pi may change the calculation as to whether or not we consider it an engineer's primary OS, so that's worth watching to see if that happens. Okay, so let's talk next about virtual machines.